All right, so we are moving to the next section, and we're going to talk about the imminent war now. To be imminent means to be unavoidable. It's an SAT word for you really smart kids out there that are going to take the SAT and go on to university. But this unavoidable war, and there's been this question for a long time of, is the American Revolution imminent? Is it unavoidable? We have almost always taught the American Revolution as a foregone conclusion, as something that was going to happen no matter what we did. Our actions were not going to change anything. But I don't know that that's true. So let's look at some facts. One of the first things I want to look at is some American myths. That's a term that we don't always use properly, myth. Y'all are all intelligent people. You've been around the block education, in the education world. You know what a myth is. You learned about them in school. A myth is just something we agree to believe. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true or that it's false, but we have agreed to believe it. George Washington cherry tree myth of chopping down the cherry tree and telling his dad, "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree." We've agreed to believe that. There's no evidence for it, but we've agreed to believe it. That's a myth, okay? Pecos Bill, Paul Bunyan, those are myths. Well, in history, we have some American myths too. First is that Americans were overtaxed. If you took Miss Thistlebottom's class like I did, you were told your whole life that we had a tax revolution. Remember, no taxation without representation. We were fighting because we didn't want to pay these high British taxes. Well, that's at least partially true. We didn't want to pay the taxes. We absolutely did not want to pay the taxes. It absolutely was a tax revolution. But that does not necessarily mean that the taxes were high. Americans, in fact, paid lower taxes than their counterparts in England did. Okay? So to say that we were overtaxed is probably incorrect. Okay? We had fought this French and Indian War and and we had to pay for it, and most of that brunt of that was being paid for by people in England. So let's kind of push that myth back. The second myth is taxation without representation. This is another one that's kind of true. Taxation without representation. The reason why we said this, why that became the battle cry, no taxation without representation, became the battle cry for the Sons of Liberty, is because we had no voice in Parliament directly. We didn't directly elect a member of Parliament. The House of Lords and the House of Commons, neither one had a member that was elected by the American colonists. So we said, we are not represented, we didn't vote for it. That's because in America, we have long believed in something called direct representation. We still believe in direct representation in this country. If you don't know what that is, that's the belief that we elect someone that directly represents our district. When you go vote for your congressman is there to represent you, your specific congressional district, not all of the United States, you. Your two senators are there to represent your state, not the other 49 states. It's direct representation. In England, they don't understand that still today. They believe in something called virtual representation. They believe that every member of the House of Lords, every member of the House of Commons represents all of the empire. So they might be elected locally, but they're not there as the representatives of just those people. They are there as the representatives of every member of the empire. So when we would scream, no taxation without representation, I'm not represented, they didn't know what we were talking about. They're going, what do you mean you're not represented? The king represents you, the House of Lords represents you, the House of Commons represents you. You're represented by everybody. You're overrepresented, if anything. We didn't comprehend that. It was just two different theories, okay? Y'all comprehend the difference here? That's actually a pretty difficult concept for a lot of students to get. So if you're not understanding, let me know. And I will try and use smaller words. Or maybe charades or something, I don't know. We're good, okay. So let's look at some of the things that happen that make this revolution a little more imminent. The first big one that we despised was the Sugar Act. This is back in 1764. George Grenville became prime minister. I know his name is spelled Greenville, like the city. By the way, I was born in that city, and I'm not proud of that fact. Whew, Greenville, Texas. Terrible place, terrible place. Don't go there. Lord Grenville is made prime minister, and he realizes that the colonists have to get more invested in the repayment of debts. So he's got to find some way to raise money. So he comes up with a duty to put first on sugar, that was the big one, and later on coffee, although coffee was not a big drink at this time period. If you don't know what a duty is, a duty and a tariff are the same thing. They're just different words for it. It's a tax on imported goods, okay? It's a tax on anything that you import into your country. I know y'all are in college and you know what an import is and an export is, but just in case somebody doesn't, think import comes in, export exits, okay? If it leaves the country, it's an export. If it comes in the country, it's an import. So this is a tax on imported sugar and coffee, which was all sugar and coffee. Americans didn't want to pay it. We felt like it was unfair because it was a tax that was placed on us, but it wasn't placed on citizens, British citizens that lived in England. So it's unjust. We're not being treated the same as other members of the empire. We should pay the same taxes that they pay, at least in this case. So in order to get around this, smuggling became an acceptable business practice. Some of our greatest Americans that we celebrate now were smugglers. John Hancock and Sam Adams are two that I can think of off the top of my head. Both were notorious smugglers. They brought in illegal tea, illegal coffee, illegal sugar, and they sold it without collecting the taxes. These smugglers were providing a good that Americans needed at a price they could afford most of the time. And they were seen as heroes. If you want an example, think of the movie Gone with the Wind, if you've seen that. Rhett Butler in that movie is the big hero in the movie. And he was a blockade runner that was smuggling in stuff to the south after the north had blockaded. Well, that's what these guys were. They were heroes. They were like Robin Hood. They were fighting against the system to help the poor. At least that's the way people saw it. Well, England needs to get control of this smuggling, and they come up with a system for doing it. It's called the Admiralty Court. Now, I can't imagine anything that is less American or even less English than an Admiralty Court. Because remember, the English were the freest people in the world at this time. They had trial by jury in England since Magna Carta back in 1215. So you think about it, it's 1700. It's 500 years later. They've had trial by jury for 500 years. And in America, they established a smuggling court just to enforce smuggling laws with no jury. It's called an Admiralty Court because an admiral was the judge for it. Okay? At least it was usually an admiral. It was a high-ranking British officer. They were extremely strict. There was no jury. All that happened was if you were accused of smuggling, your accusers brought the evidence. They presented it to the admiral. If the admiral found you were guilty, they would then go in and take the product, take your ship, take all that, sell it off, and the king, the crown, would get the money, at least most of the money. Turns out, here's the really bad part about it. The judge, the admiral that was deciding this, only got paid if he found you guilty, because he got paid a percentage of the amount of money he collected for the crown. So if he finds you innocent, he didn't collect any money for the crown, he's not getting paid anything for that case. Do you think they found very many people innocent? No. The economic system is encouraging guilt. It's not just encouraging guilt, it's encouraging falsely accusing people. And this is what was going on in some cases. The admiral was making deals with other people saying, hey, you go accuse that guy of smuggling. He just bought this. He bought this whole shipload of goods in. You accuse him of smuggling, bring the charges against him. I'll find him guilty and we'll split the difference. And they were accusing people that there was no evidence that they were actually smuggling. Now, that having been said, I think most of them were guilty because most Americans were participating in this. And it was very hard to stop smuggling. Think about how long our coastline is through 13 colonies. Do you think you can watch the whole coastline? It's pretty tough, right? Particularly in North Carolina where all the pirates are hanging out. They can do whatever they want. So this Sugar Act is hated, but even more so, the British response to it is hated. Americans feel like their traditional rights of an Englishman, their right to a trial by jury, has been taken away from them. This is one more weight dropped on that scale right there that's balancing whether we're going to declare independence or stay loyal. And it doesn't take much because this scale is going back and forth, okay? John Adams famously said at one point that at any point in the revolution, there was 1/3 that was for revolution, 1/3 that was against revolution, and 1/3 that swayed with the wind. I always say that I compare them to Dallas Cowboys fans. You know, there's 1/3 of the people that love the Cowboys no matter what, 1/3 of the people that hate the Cowboys, and 1/3 of the people that like them when they're winning. That's exactly what the American Revolution was like, okay? All right. The next big hated law was the Stamp Act. This is 1765. Now, you've all been taught about the Stamp Act before, and I think you probably have a pretty good understanding of it. This is 8th grade material. But I've found over the years that a lot of people don't really comprehend why it was so hated. So let's look at it. The Stamp Act was a tax. It required a stamp be put on certain goods. Now, don't think of this stamp like a postage stamp. It was more like when you go to the notary public and get the notarized stamp on your thing. It's just basically you go pay a tax and the government puts a stamp on it saying that you've paid it. Any legal document had to be stamped. Any marriage deed had to be stamped, marriage license. Any property deed had to be stamped. Advertisements, if you put a pamphlet out advertising a good, it had to have a stamp. Newspapers, this is the part that they hated the most, was the next two. Newspapers were hated, and playing cards. Playing cards? In some colonies, it was illegal to play cards anyway. But if you did, you had to pay a tax for them. Your diploma from high school would have had to have a stamp on it. Now, we're looking at all this and we're going, that's a lot of taxes. Basically, anything made of paper had a stamp. Is what it comes down to. Okay? Now, why do they hate this? Well, because it's kind of an indirect tax. It's not something you can control. It's kind of hidden from you. You don't really notice it so much. And that's kind of a sneaky way to tax people. It's not a big tax. It's a little bitty tax over and over and over again. But it was enough to make us go to revolution. This tax was the biggest thing that pushed us over the limits of the revolution. And I find it humorous today at how we have changed so much. Because we went to revolution over this once upon a time. But guys, I got news for you. If you go get married, it's got to be notarized, and it gets a stamp. It gets a stamp on it, and you got to pay for that. If you go buy property today, it's got to be notarized. You get a stamp on it. When you get your college diploma, there's an emblazoned stamp on the middle of it, the university seal. You're paying for that. Okay? These little stamp taxes are all around us now. We just don't call it that anymore. We don't hear that. We have lots of little hidden taxes. Lots of hidden taxes. By the way, your gas, when you go buy your gas, about 60% of the cost of your gas is taxes. By the time they add everything on it. So serious issues. At this time, though, people were ready to fight over it. And they called a Congress. Now, I know I've said this before in here, but I like to say it over and over again because I have the same stories. Congress just means meeting. That's all that word means, okay? Technically, we are in Congress right now. Our three classes, our three campuses are meeting in Congress. We are having a meeting. So when you say the Stamp Act Congress, don't think of lawmaking body. Think of, this is a meeting from people from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island didn't show up. And their plan is to figure out how to deal with the Stamp Act. They meet in New York, which was the most important city in America at this point. It had surpassed Philadelphia and well surpassed Boston. And they had passed 14 resolutions. The biggest one was they had agreed to boycott buying all goods that required a stamp. Write that down somewhere. They had agreed to boycott all goods requiring a stamp. How do you do that? They said, well, we're still going to print our newspapers, but we're not going to put a stamp on them. We're going to do it illegally. We're going to print our playing cards, but we're going to do it illegally. We just won't register our property deeds. What we'll do is we'll just make a note between us and have a gentleman's deal with it. And people just started going around the law. Other people took a more serious stand. A group called the Sons of Liberty are established. They're actually first established in Boston. But in New York, they're going to get very violent. The Sons of Liberty are going to meet at a bar, and they're going to be plied with lots and lots of beer. And when they get good and sloshed, they decide that it's a good idea to go to the tax collector's house and burn it to the ground. These patriots showed up at Andrew Oliver's house in what's gone down in history as the Stamp Act riots. And they literally set the tax collector's home on fire. They also tarred and feathered him. Now, I'll show you a picture of what that looks like here in a little while. But tarring and feathering is literally pouring hot tar on somebody and then coating them in down feathers, whether they be geese feathers or duck feathers or chicken feathers, but feathers are put all over them. And there's two reasons for this. One is to humiliate them. And the second reason
when they pluck off the feathers, the target's stuck to your skin and pulls it out.
That's right. It
Torture
sticks to your
method.
skin, and when they pull it off, chunks of flesh come off with it.
So it's a torture method.
It's a torture method. Absolutely is.
I know a lot about torture methods.
That's pretty scary. I've got an expert on torture over here in my class. That's remind me not to make you angry at all. Do I need to change your grade, darling? Because I'm a little concerned.
I could be a torture person.
Now she's back there saying, "I'll torture you too if you'll change my grade." Oh, wow.
I think you
All right.
your hair is torture enough.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. I feel so loved. Losing my hair is torture enough. God only made a few perfect heads and the rest he covered with hair. That's all I'm saying. All right. You don't cover up sexy.
Oh, man.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more about what goes on here, because the most famous person to come out of these congresses was Patrick Henry of Virginia. Patrick Henry was the original firebrand. If you don't know what a firebrand is, that's one of those old-fashioned terms that we use. It's somebody that can speak publicly and fire up a crowd. Think of the old-fashioned Baptist minister that you show up at church on Sunday and he yells at you for 45 minutes, and you get through and your heart's just racing. You don't know what's going on. Well, that's what Patrick Henry was. He gave a great speech, and he gives his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech right here. You've all heard it before. I have it up here. I will try and get through it without coughing and hacking all over the place. Patrick Henry gives this. Listen to these words. People don't talk like this anymore, and I think it's sad because I love the poetry of it. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Those words are incredible. And if you look at it, what he's saying here is they're already fighting. I know we haven't declared war, but war is already in effect. The British have already fired at the Americans. The Americans are already in the field disobeying the law. The Admiralty courts are already abusing you. Are you going to stand here and be treated like a slave or a second-class citizen? Or are you going to stand up and fight for what you believe? Are you a man or a mouse? Okay? Now, I don't know about you guys. I knew what this guy was saying before I read it. And I'm ready to go fight somebody right now. To me, this is like, they might as well play the Rocky theme music in the background right now. I'm ready to go. This kind of, it works. I wish we had speakers like this today that could move people to action on events. I think it's harder now to do it. I think there's so much more media now out there that we're kind of jaded to it. I see some of you are actually writing that down. I'll let you get caught up with it. You don't have to write it down if you don't want to. I put it up there kind of for our own sake. But I understand why some of you want to. So I'll give you a minute or so to write on it.
I have a question. Do you have like a time range of when our next test will be? Next month?
This one, there's 3 lectures before your next test.
So
this one and 2 more.
Are these 14 slots one?
Yes.
And the other half is 2, and
Yeah.
then the next one's 3?
Yeah. So probably, I don't know.
November?
It'll be in November, yeah. Probably early November. Probably the first week, if I had to guess.
Oh, we're almost done with this. Yeah.
I try and get all the way through the American Revolution before we do that. So, yeah. American Revolution and Washington, Jefferson, and Adams. I'm trying to do all that together. If you've not started looking at your research paper, it's time to start now, guys. I think everybody's got a topic, so we just need to get it up, get started on it. Also, I think there's about 2 people that still haven't taken that Angelina College quiz that's on Blackboard that you're required to take. Again, that's not my assignment, that's from the college. You have to take that, so if you've not done it, go now and do it. Like today, I've got to turn that in by the end of the week to the college, telling them how we did. And besides, it's like ridiculously easy. By the way, I said I wasn't going to count that on your grades, but like everybody's got hundreds on it, so I'm putting it in there to try and help your grades out. So it's like stupid easy. I think you can handle it.
Wait, when is the research paper due?
That's not
December
due.
9th.
Yeah. Till December.
I'm good with dates.
She's tough. 2 days after Pearl Harbor Day. I didn't help you out.
Is it the 9th or the 19th?
It's right around there.
Yeah,
It's
Pearl
right around
Harbor's
there.
on December 7th.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
I mean,
December 7, 1941.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did a whole research thing over that.
I bet
You did? Good.
Miss Lena.
Are y'all still writing?
Let me come over there.
You are just writing it, not translating it into ancient Hebrew, right? Okay. All right. I think we're good now. So let's move on. All right. So how is England going to deal with the opposition to the Stamp Act? They need to put down this revolution quickly, but they also need to win. So England comes up with something called the Declaratory Act, and they kind of outsmarted us. And we were kind of simple-minded people, as we Americans are wont to be sometimes, myself included. The argument we had against the Stamp Act, remember, was the Stamp Act is not legitimate because Parliament is not responsible for us because we didn't vote for Parliament. That is our argument. So Parliament comes through and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to repeal the Stamp Act. You don't like it. We respect you. We're going to repeal that act. But that's the first part. The second part is, and this is why it's called the Declaratory Act, is we're going to repeal it, but when we repeal it, there's a clause in there that says, but the colonies are subordinate to Parliament in all affairs. So we only read the first part. We read it and we go, ah, yay, they repealed the Stamp Act, and we celebrated it. And then Parliament laughed at us because by celebrating that and cheering that this act had done what we wanted it to do, we had also agreed, Parliament is in charge. They'd outsmarted us. They'd stuck that little caveat in there, you know. That's why it's called the Declaratory Act. It declared Parliament as superior. Well, that kind of pushed the Stamp Act down, got rid of that, and got rid of some of those. But pretty quick, people started reading this going, now if Parliament passed something, we don't have a legitimate complaint anymore. If they pass another tax, we can't say, you're not our legitimate leader because we didn't vote for you. They'll go, right here. You agreed to this. And it said in there that we are. You agreed to it. You should have read the small print. You know, read the fine print. Otherwise you end up buying a crappy car or joining the wrong branch of the military or something. Everybody got it? All right. All right, so the Stamp Act's gone, but the problem's not gone. We still have that issue of having to pay back our debt. How are we going to go about paying back our debt? Well, Charles Townshend becomes the exchequer. That's a fancy Latin word for taxman. It literally means what it sounds like. If you want to know how to remember this, the exchequer's name was that because he had a list of everybody that owed taxes, and when you paid it, he checked your name with an X next to it, and that meant you paid your taxes. He was an exchequer, okay? So, he came up with a plan. He said, I'll tell you what, I can tax them, and they won't even know they're being taxed. We'll give them an indirect taxation policy. How does an indirect taxation policy work? Well, instead of making the end consumer pay the tax, we're going to tax the raw materials that go into the product, so the manufacturer pays the taxes, and that's a smaller group of people. Now it's going to get passed on. I mean, if I manufacture something and have to pay the taxes, I'm just going to raise the price of the product when I sell it to the end consumer to cover it, okay? And that's what happened. But this was a hated tax. It was lead was the biggest one, but it also taxed glass. It taxed paint. All these objects that went into things. Why was lead the big one? Think about everything that lead was in back then. Lead was in the paint. Lead was in the glass when they made it. Lead was in your most of your silverware and plates were lead back then. Everything had lead in it. It was a cheap, affordable metal, and we didn't yet know that it would kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So a tax on lead was a massive tax. Well, he then puts a board of customs commissioners in charge of collecting it. And the customs commissioners are kind of like that admiralty court. They don't respect the law or the rights of Englishmen very well. And the Massachusetts legislature, which was always the place with the most rebels in it, they decide to address this. They meet and they send out a circular letter. If you don't know what a circular letter is, it's where I'm going to write down all the grievances I have about something, and then I'm going to send it to you, and then you're going to write down everything you don't like, and you're going to send it to the next colony, and they're going to write down all the things they don't like. And it goes in a circle till it comes back to you. And why do you do this? Well, because now everybody in all the colonies are aware of what's going on everywhere. And it doesn't seem like, you know, I've got a problem with my guy here. There's a problem with how England is running crap, okay? It's a way of getting things around. Well, this circular letter called for a voluntary boycott of all English goods. They said, we'll show them, we just won't buy anything English. Well, that's kind of a problem, because we didn't manufacture anything really. So a boycott of English goods meant you just weren't getting anything. Everything came from England. People didn't really participate very well. A lot of people ignored the boycott. But the governor of Massachusetts does not ignore it. His name was Lord Hillsborough. And Lord Hillsborough dissolves the Massachusetts legislature. If you don't know what that is, the Massachusetts legislature was the one body of government that the people of Massachusetts got to vote for. They didn't get to vote for Parliament, they didn't get to vote for their governor, but they did get to vote for their legislature. And Lord Hillsborough says, these guys committed treason. No more legislature, send them home. He's going to rule them directly. That was a mistake. Because as Englishmen, you have a right to a say in your government. Way back in 1215, Magna Carta said, the king's power is limited. It's granted him by the people, and if the people don't like it, they can remove the king even. They can remove a governor. And they're looking at this thing going, you took away our only voice in government. It would be like if tomorrow you found out that Donald Trump sent Congress home. I don't know about you, but I'd be grabbing my musket, okay? It's a scary thought. And that's what happened. They were taking our rights away. Boston is the major hotbed of revolution. And it's all going to come to the forefront with the Boston Massacre. One of the most misnamed things in history, but a great name. When they came up with the name Boston Massacre, they knew what they were doing. They were selling you an idea. March 5th, 1770. Let me tell you the story as I was told it. We'll do the thistle-bottom version of the story. And then we'll blow holes in it because that's fun to do. I was taught it that military law had been engaged in England, in Boston. The rights of the people were being trampled on, and this patriotic group of men known as the Sons of Liberty had gotten together and decided to stand up to those redcoats. And they had gone out and protested in the streets. And this lawful protest was put down with musket fire from England. They murdered those Americans in the street. That's how I was taught it by Miss Thistlebottom. Now let's talk about what really happened. Military law had been put in place in Massachusetts. That part is correct. And maybe it was a group of patriots. It was, I would argue the Sons of Liberty were a patriotic group. But they were something else too. They were a bunch of drunks. And Sons of Liberty was founded by this guy, Samuel Adams. You might recognize that name from the beer company. There's a reason why they named a beer company after Samuel Adams, okay? Samuel Adams was another firebrand speaker. He was really good at firing up a crowd. And he was the leading proponent in Massachusetts for independence already. And he doesn't like the martial law that's going on. Think about the things that England was doing. They were housing troops in our homes against our will. They had put a curfew in place where you couldn't be out in the streets after a certain time. They had taken away our legislature. England had done a lot of horrible things. And in comes Sam Adams. And he's looking around for an army. He needs a private army. And you know where you can find a private army?
The bar.
There was a bar called the Green Dragon. Right off of Boston Common. It's near where Harvard is today. Still there, by the way. And he walks into the Green Dragon, and all his buddies are there. And he buys everybody around. And he starts talking about the horrible things the English did. Can you believe what those British people did this time? They quartered troops in Martha's house. And he buys another round of drinks. And can you believe they don't let you travel the way you want to? You got to be home in your bed at dark. A curfew? We're citizens. And he buys another round of drinks. And can you believe they dissolved the legislature? We don't even get a voice in our government anymore. And he buys another round of drinks. And he says, and how about those admiralty courts where they took away our right to trial by jury? And he buys another round of drinks. And the next thing you know, he's standing up on the bar screaming, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Are you with me? Yeah, we're with you. We're drunk and patriotic. We're with you. And they decide that it would be a good idea to go outside in March of 1770 in Boston, where it's cold, I don't know if you know much about Boston, but they have 2 seasons in Boston. They have winter and July 4th, okay? It's cold in March. There's ice on the ground. And here's the other thing they don't tell you. It's a fishing village. Guess what they use to pave the streets with? Oyster shells. So the streets are coated in ice and oyster shells. Keep that in mind. And these guys go outside after having a few drinks and they see the redcoats marching. We'll show them. They decide it's a good idea to scoop up some ice and throw snowballs at the heavily armed military men. This is a stupid decision. Now, if they're scooping them up on the road to grab this ice, this is ice with oyster shells in it. Y'all ever seen an oyster shell? Those things are sharp. They are basically throwing rocks at them, okay? You want to see what this is like? I want you to drive down to Lufkin and just kind of stand on the side of the road, and when a cop comes by, throw a brick at him and see what happens. Okay? Don't do that. That's the equivalent of what's going on here. These guys got drunk and threw rocks, basically, at soldiers. They're trying to pick a fight. They are trying to pick a fight. The officer orders his men, don't fire. Don't fire. Stay back. Stay back. And then these guys came out and they had these bats, these clubs. Why would they have clubs? Well, these guys made rope back there. It's a shipping village. And if you ever see how you make rope, you weave the small strings together and they take a bat and they slam it into it to get it tighter, okay? Well, these guys took these rope bats that they had, and one of the guys got hit, one of the British soldiers got hit in the head with a bat. And they hear from the alley behind it, "Fire, damn you! Fire, damn you!" And the British fired. They fired on this group of people. Now, some evidence came about later on that the British thought that it was their commander saying this. But in fact, it was probably Sam Adams saying it. Because if they fire, does he have another excuse for war? Yeah. Now they've shot at our people. Now it's open aggression. All we did was throw snowballs at you and you shot our guys? I think that's a little ridiculous. Well, it wasn't just snowballs, it was rocks, right? But they fired. Crispus Attucks is the first death of the American Revolution. By the way, make a note to yourself, Crispus Attucks was not just the first death. He was a free black man. So the first person to die in the cause of the American Revolution was a free black man, Crispus Attucks. Interestingly enough, they put these guys on trial. And in the trial, none other than John Adams, the future second president, the guy that's the first vice president, the second president, the guy whose idea it's going to be later on to declare independence was John Adams. He is the lawyer that defends the Redcoats. And they hated him for it. By the way, he's also Sam Adams' cousin. So you had Sam Adams on one side and John Adams on the other. You want to find somebody that you can respect? John Adams is one of those guys. He defends these redcoats, and it's a tough battle. It's a tough thing to defend against because he had already been a proponent of independence. But he looked around and he said, these men are not guilty. And even if they are guilty, they have a right to a fair trial. He said, we can't argue that they're not, that they're taking away our right to a jury trial and then take away this guy's right. We got to be fair. One of the other things he had to fight against was the fact that there was an engraving that was put out. A guy named Paul Revere, you all know Paul Revere from the Midnight Ride, right? Listen, children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. You all heard that story when you were a kid. Well, before he was that Midnight Rider, Paul Revere was the most famous silversmith in Massachusetts. And he made an engraving, a silver engraving. And it was later on used to print of a picture of what happened that day. And he's the one that names his picture the Boston Massacre. Now, a handful of people died. I wouldn't call it a massacre, but he did. And everybody that saw his picture, that's going to be the way they learn about it. This is the famous painting. Now again, this is from Paul Revere's engraving. And what they would do is they would take and they put ink on that silver engraving. They would print with it, and then they would hand paint it. So there's a bunch of versions of this, and they're all just a little bit different because of how they're hand painted. But this is the gist of what people see. Now, is this an accurate rendition of what's been described to you in the Boston Massacre? No. There's a lot wrong with this. First off, I don't see any snow on the ground. Second off, it's, if you look behind, I don't know, y'all can't see it very well, but there's a little hidden message. The building behind the Redcoats is called Butcher's Hall. That was done on purpose because they wanted the word butcher to be above the Redcoats, because butchers kill and destroy. If you look at the faces, the Redcoats' faces look very, very brutal, while the Americans look very, very... There's even a cute little dog in the painting, and for some reason there's a nun in it. I don't know why there's a nun in there. There's also no black men in that picture, okay? And we know that there were people there. Crispus Attucks died. There's a lot wrong with this painting. But if all you got, the only news you got about the Boston Massacre was you saw this painting, are you going to be angry? Mm-hmm. Those Britons killed, they shot a nun and maybe a dog. We don't like these guys, right? This is propaganda. This is bias. That's one of the problems we have in history, is identifying what's a fact and what's bias. This is bias, okay? All right. Next big law that's passed is the Tea Act. By the way, if you've never seen the HBO miniseries John Adams, there is a great scene. You can actually get it on YouTube. You can type in the Boston Massacre trial, and you can watch it. And it's word for word what was said at the trial. And you can actually watch John Adams defend these guys. It's pretty interesting. Great miniseries. I would highly suggest it for somebody. The Tea Act, May of 1773. The Tea Act is another thing that's greatly misunderstood. Yes, it was a tax on tea, but that wasn't really the part we hated. The part we hated was that it gave a monopoly to the East India Company. It said that only the East India Company would be allowed to sell tea in America. Why would we hate that? Well, remember, Sam Adams, John Hancock, a lot of these guys made their living bringing in tea. Well, now, it's illegal for them to. We didn't like that. So Sam Adams gets his buddies drunk again and says, what are we going to do about this? Well, what we're going to do about it is we're going to have a little party. Now famous Boston Tea Party. The Dartmouth was a British East India Company ship that was loaded with tea. But Sam Adams has his own ship coming in called the Liberty. And the Liberty is also loaded with tea. Adams can't legally sell his, but Americans want their tea. We are tea addicts.
Isn't Dartmouth a college?
There is a college named Dartmouth too, yes. They're not related. I don't think. Well, finally, on December 16th, 1773, Sam Adams calls his Sons of Liberty up to meet again. And in his typical way, he decides to have a few drinks with them. And when they get good and sloshed, he says, I have a great idea. By the way, if you're with your friends and you've had too much to drink and they say, I have a great idea, that's a good time to leave. Yeah. Okay? Well, he says, I have a great idea. let's dress up like Indians and go dump the tea in the harbor. And everybody had just enough to drink that they went, okay, we'll do our village people thing. We'll dress up like Indians and go take care of this. Now, I say they dressed up like Indians. They dressed up like Indians in the same way that you dressed up like an Indian in 3rd grade for your Thanksgiving program, okay? They didn't really look like Indians. They stuck a feather in their hair and put makeup on, okay? They're not really trying to make anybody think that crazy wild Indians are dumping the tea in the harbor. They just don't want anybody to recognize who they are, because they're about to commit a crime, okay? They all dressed up like Indians. And at that evening, they marched down to the Dartmouth. They boarded the ship. And interestingly enough, they were given an order that you are not going to damage anything. We are not, the ship's owner is not our enemy. We are here because we don't like the tea situation. So we're going to come up there and we're just going to dump the tea. And they found a guard waiting. And they told the guard, listen, you can give us the key and we'll unlock your deck and we'll dump this tea overboard, and when we're done, we'll even clean up and give you the key back and everything will be fine and we won't damage any of your goods. Or you could not give us a key and we're just going to go through you and get it. And the guard handed the key off. And these guys boarded the ship, they unlocked it, they took all the tea out, they dumped it in the harbor. When they were through, they said they even mopped up and cleaned up after themselves. The ship was cleaner when they were done than it was when they started. Because they did not want to make an enemy of the ship owner. The idea was, you're not the enemy. England, the East India Company, Parliament, they're the enemy. That's why we're dumping the tea in the harbor. Here's the problem. The single biggest stockholder in the East India Company was the King of England. So you have just hurt the King of England's pocketbook. You have thrown the equivalent today of hundreds of thousands of dollars of tea into the harbor. I don't know how much it was, but they said it stained the harbor. Biggest cup of tea you ever saw. Okay? Our little tea party. England's going to respond. They're going to respond with a series of laws that they called the Coercive Acts because they were there to coerce us to behave. We had a different name for them. We called them the Intolerable Acts. I imagine we also had some other names for them that we can't repeat here. But we called them the Intolerable Acts because we weren't going to tolerate this nonsense. There was a lot of parts to it, but here are the big ones. The Boston Port Act. And make a note to yourself, the Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until all the damaged tea was paid for. Closed the port of Boston until all the damaged tea was paid for. Well, that's kind of stupid. How did Boston make their money? They were a shipping village. They made their money by shipping goods, buying and selling goods. How do you pay for it if you close their business? They closed the port. The second one was the Administration of Justice Act. This was a response to the Boston Massacre more than anything else. This allowed redcoats to demand that their trial be held in England instead of in the colonies. So if a British soldier committed a crime, they could demand their trial be shipped back to England and be done on the island instead of here. Think they'll get a fair trial there? They wouldn't get a fair trial here. I ain't gonna get a fair trial there. You got bias one way or the other. They're going to be found innocent in England, and they're going to be found guilty here. So it's up in the air. And the Massachusetts Government Act just formally dissolved the Massachusetts government. It got rid of it. There was no more government. The royal governor was in charge. All three of these were hated. We believe that it violates our rights as Englishmen. Let's see where we are on here.
You have one more, and that's it.
Have one more, okay, good.
And that's just the reasons for revolution.
All right, so we are now at the revolution. We are about, the revolution has technically started. We have not actually declared independence yet, but everything's there. So let's look at the reasons why we're ready to go to war. This slide right here is an essay question on your next test. Okay? First off was the proclamation line of 1763. They had put that line in place, if you remember correctly, at the Appalachian Mountains, and they said, you can't cross these mountains for any reason, ever, period. You cannot cross these. Even after we had won the French and Indian War against it, to capture all that land. Well, we didn't like that. The next one is the frontier thesis. When I was a young man in college, you had to, if you studied history, you had to study Walter Prescott Webb and Frederick Jackson Turner. And Frederick Jackson Turner wrote something called the frontier thesis. It was the most important thesis in American history. I still think it's super important, although it's kind of out of vogue now. That is the belief that what makes Americans different from other places in the world is the fact that we had to test ourselves against a wild frontier when others didn't. And that made us more rugged, more individualistic, and less willing to deal with governments. So if you look at that, if you believe that, then you know that just the fact that we were Americans meant we were going to fight somebody. And England was the easiest person to fight. We fought the Indians, we beat the Indians, and then we looked around and went, who's next? Oh, England. America has always done that. We still do that. When we finish one war, we look around and go, okay, who's going to piss us off now? It's how we are as a nation. I don't like that, but it is. The third reason is mercantilism. Mercantilism is just the belief that colonies exist to make the mother country rich. And the fact that they had passed these laws, these navigation acts, with a list of enumerated goods that could only be sold to England. These were these goods that you were not allowed to sell anywhere else. That's going to make us want to go to war, because Spain would pay us more for it. France would pay us more for it. But we couldn't sell it to Spain or France because England said you had to sell only to England, and this is what we're going to pay you for it. We don't like that. We want to sell our goods wherever we can get the highest product. Next is salutary neglect, sometimes called benign neglect. That's just, the example I like to give is, y'all ever known that kid that when you were growing up, mom and dad let them do anything they wanted to, and they ran